What's up, guys? David Sherwack here. Today, I have a very special guest with me. Today, I have Jeffrey Troop from the channel Movie Husbands. If you guys aren't familiar, I'll link it down below. And yeah, we're going to be talking about some music today. We're going to be talking about our favorite albums of all time. Kind of just go through it. And yeah, how's it going?
Good, man. Very happy to be here. This is super cool. So I guess the just kind of an introduction for myself. So me and my husband run a film review channel called Movie Husbands. We review mostly films that are like modern and more of like a independent or foreign vein, but we did like review Wicked and stuff. Like we'll do the normal stuff. But it's a cool little channel and kind of fun side hobby for the two of us that we just really like doing. And obviously my second favorite thing aside from movies is music. So that's kind of how I got to know your channel, and I offered this idea. How about you come on my channel and talk about some of your favorite movies? I go on your channel, talk about some of our favorite albums. So that's why we're here today.
We're going to get into it. We have 5 albums each. Do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
Yeah, I guess I'll go first. So I guess I'll start with The Downward Spiral by 9 Inch Nails. This is, I think, I don't want to say a lot of people's favorite albums, but this is widely recognized, I think, as one of the best albums of the 90s for sure. I found this album like at a pivotal point in my life. Like I was starting to really get into classic rock. Like I was in this phase of like, I just liked really long screeching guitar solos, like just music that like I still have an affinity for today, but just something that was like, I was getting very like stuck in one mold of thinking about music. And looking at some of the best albums of the 90s, like, you know, I was listening to a lot of Nirvana and Pearl Jam and stuff. I kept seeing 9 Inch Nails being mentioned. So I picked up the CD. Yes, I'm old. So I picked up the CD at Circuit City and I listened to it, and I really didn't like it at first. I was like, this was not what I was expecting, and I think that a lot of times when you get stuck in like a mold, you're not ready for experimentation on that level. So I started listening to it more and more, and just like, I was really struck by Trent's talent for composition. So like, obviously,
Yeah.
That's become even more of a thing because he's, you know, he did the soundtrack for Challengers and Soul and Social Network, all these movies.
Wait,
did you know that?
He did Challengers? What the heck?
Yeah, man.
That's
yeah.
crazy.
Trent Reznor and his producing partner Atticus Ross, he made the music for Challengers and the Disney movie Soul, and a bunch of other movies. He's won 2 Oscars now.
Wow.
Which is bizarre. But yeah, just his talent for composition, and like, this is where I kind of learned, like, I think maybe my music went from just like a visceral emotional thing to like more of an analyzing, like analysis type of listening, where this music is really fun to like pick apart all the individual parts and then see how it comes together as a whole, because it's really well composed, and there's a variety of like really complicated sound textures. So like, I think this album just taught me more so how to like listen to music with a more analytical edge and like break it down. And obviously, I've never had a mental health struggle quite as strong as what this album is, but if you're having a bad day, there's probably a few things on this album that you'll identify with. And I think this, actually, Anthony Fantano said this, so I want to credit him, but if you listen to the album, like, it doesn't sound like it's aged a day. Like, it sounds like it was made yesterday, and it's like 30 years old.
Yeah, no,
So I know you have a reaction to this, so what did you think of this record?
I do have a reaction. I'm going to be honest, I didn't listen to it after that reaction until just like a couple days ago. But yeah, it's a crazy album, man. It's like, I feel like it's one of like the most like immersive concept albums I've heard. It's nasty, it's animalistic, it's horrifying. Production is insane on this. Like, I feel like there's a lot of it that is sample based. I might be wrong in that, but it feels like there's some really creative sampling going on throughout this album. So I find that pretty interesting.
I think I read this at one point that the way he like begins, and this is actually similar to, I think, the way Tom York begins with Radiohead songs, is he like starts out with like a pretty simple melody on piano, and he just gradually starts adding in layers and layers and layers. And so I think some of that is sampling, and some of it is just like a variety of studio tinkering.
Okay.
You know, back in the 90s, like, he really didn't, there wasn't a lot of 9 Inch Nails output. He was like an every 6 or 7 years album maker, and that was because he was just like in the studio like a madman. But yeah, I think it's made like one of the best albums ever.
Yeah. I think vocally too, it's really interesting. Like I don't know, he shows a lot of range vocally on this. Not in terms of like hitting high notes and then hitting super low notes, but he'll go from like a kind of haunting whispered delivery and then just full out screaming within a matter of like 2 seconds, you know? So I think, yeah, like vocally, it's honestly a lot more impressive than I thought it would be before I first listened to it. Should we go into my first pick here?
Yes, sir.
Now, I'm going to preface this a little bit and say that you guys might be surprised that these are what I picked, but I didn't want to necessarily talk about albums that I've already talked about a bunch on my channel. I guess I'll get into this first one here. This one is actually legit one of my favorite albums of all time, and probably easily my favorite album of all time. It's The Glow Part 2 by The Microphones. This is like one of the first albums that I really started to get into when I first started really getting into music, you know? Dude, I love how like messy everything is on this album. Like if you listen to the guitars on this album, they are not a lot of the time they are not what you would expect them to be, the way they're being played and the way they're mixed. They just feel kind of off at times, but I don't know. I think it creates something really special in that sense, and it feels like purposefully messy, you know? It's very in tune with nature and very in tune with kind of, I guess, existentialist kind of themes. I love Phil's writing on here. I love his kind of, I guess, boyish vocals, I guess you could call them. Very innocent, very human and very raw. Yeah, going back to the guitars, I love how they just kind of like intertwine on this album to create something that doesn't feel structurally like traditional, you know, but it feels like, and this is going to sound kind of corny. I'm going to admit it. This is going to sound kind of corny, but they mesh together in a way that feels like if you're out in the forest and you see like foliage and it's just kind of like, it's just kind of random, and nature's kind of random in general, and it's intertwined in this kind of random way. Because of that, it feels super timeless as well, while yes, you can call it like noise rock, lo-fi, indie rock, whatever you want to call it. To me, it doesn't feel like confined to any specific moment in time. And I think it's because of the lyrics as well. They're kind of really vague and existentialist. And yeah, I just love the connection to nature on this album. I feel like it's, in my life at least, that connection to nature feels missing at times. And I feel like lots of people can relate to that. So this album, even though I'm just, you know, listening to it in my basement, it kind of gives me a feeling of that connection that I think is missing in a lot of people's lives today. So I think it's great. I think it's his most immersive, dense, varied, and just breathtaking album that he's ever made. So I love it.
Yeah, so I've listened to this album before, but like
Yeah.
you putting it on your list gave me the chance to like really reckon with it because I'd always kind of it's not like totally in my avenue like in terms of music, and I was familiar with him through Mount Erie. I'd listened to like a couple of those records, so I was listening or I was used to like his talk singing style
Yeah.
and his like relentlessly sad point of view.
Yeah.
But I was listening to this on a plane ride, and I got so like it was a 2 hour plane ride, so it was pretty short, and I got so immersed in it, and it was like the first time that I really like felt the album deeply, and
Mm-hmm.
it kind of like what you were saying with nature. There's such like a reckoning with opposites on this album, like a lot of dissonant noise on the record that's been matching with like the beauty of plucking and like whispering into this like ugly wall of noise.
Yeah.
It's really really interesting. It's like beauty and dissonance colliding, which really falls into like that natural world aspect that you were talking about. Because I mean,
Mm-hmm.
a part of the natural world is a hurricane as much as it is like a beautiful forest. So this is like right up my alley lyrically though. Like I love breakup albums. You know, I say it to my husband all the time, and I think breakup albums are way more insightful about love than love albums will ever be.
Yeah.
But it's just like it's so painfully confessional, and there are like parts of it that I listen to that I know exactly what he's talking about, even though he's being so vague. Like I forget what song it is, but there was a song where he's going through like all the places he had been with his lover, and he goes back there to like feel the loneliness of how those places feel without his lover, and I
Yeah.
like completely understood that like what that was all about.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is like a pretty intense and direct record
Yeah.
emotionally.
It's interesting you say it's a breakup album because I guess it is. Like it technically is. But to me, like it just feels more vague than that in a way, to the point where like when I'm listening it, I don't immediately think of a breakup, you know, but
Mm.
that's a totally fair observation, because I think Phil himself has said that it is a breakup album. The distortion on this album is recorded so well, like the crunch to it and just the texture of that distortion. It's dude.
So I have a question about this album actually. So the last track,
Yeah.
I want to say like the last half of it is like just static, right?
Yeah.
So do you find yourself when you're listening to this album actually listening to the full last track every time? Are you that immersed in it?
That's a good point. Obviously, the first time I listened to it, I did. I'd say if I'm really feeling it, yes. If I have time, yes. But it is a good point, because it's pretty much just like a silent last half of that track with like very subtle kind of instrumental ideas from, I think, parts previously on the album that come in and just kind of like are very quiet. It's a very interesting way to end the album. It kind of reminds me of, well, I think Quedeca definitely took influence from that ending in the way that he ends I Didn't Mean to Haunt You, where it's just like the static that kind of floods in towards the end of that album. So yeah, I think it's, I don't listen to it every time I listen to it, but it does add to the concept of the album and the overall feel of it. So yeah.
Yeah, totally. I actually like if I go back to this album, and I imagine I will. I don't think I'll listen to it again, but I really liked it the first time, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
My next album is The Idler Wheel.
I root for you. I love you. You.
Can I recite this full title?
Do it.
The
Do it. By memory. By memory.
Okay, the idler wheel is wiser than the driver of the screw, and whipping cords will serve you more than something will ever do. I don't remember what
Dude.
that word is. I'm
I
pretty
think
close
that
though.
I think that was close. I think you practiced that before this video.
No, I didn't. This album's just been in my life for a long fucking time. And also, I really thought that I spent probably an abnormal amount of time thinking about the title of this album because I really like that. Will serve you more than ropes will ever do. So I majored in English literature, so like I can get pretty carried away with like the meaning of things and like symbolism and stuff. If you want to like make fun of me in the comments for like how flowery I get of my interpretations, like I totally welcome it because it's true. But anyway, I think Fiona has a similar sensibility. This is a terrific midpoint, I think, for early career Fiona and late career Fiona. Have you heard all of her albums at this point?
I have heard, I think, almost all of them.
So the first like her first two records, and they're very very well written, but like Title and When the Pawn are I think a bit more in like a particular mold. Like there's singer songwriter albums that are like something you would hear along the lines of Regina Spektor. I think they're a bit better than that. I think they're a bit more poetic, a bit more deep, but like there wasn't just this flurry of experimentation on that record. And then I would argue that Extraordinary Machine was like this real double down of like orchestral singer songwriter writing with John Bryan. And when she made the Idler Wheel, it was the first time I saw Fiona really start to like branch out and bring in these disparate elements of like junkyard percussion, just like really odd, like bizarre dissonant turns of the song. Like the songs would
Yeah.
start in places and end up in different places that you would never expect, and like these really like offbeat rhythms and unconventional production. Like and she would follow that further down the rabbit hole with Fetch the Bolt Cutters, like 9 years later. But this was really the start or like a good midpoint, I think, in
Yeah.
her discography. I just love how like the lyrics find this balance between her poeticism, but also like this real directness and intimacy that's just uncommon. You know, like I love that line in Werewolf where she says like I could liken you to a werewolf the way you left me for dead, but I provided the full moon. Like she has like as much as she has venom for people in her life, she also understands like it's some of her fault, the reason that she's in the position she's in. So I always love that like self-reflection that Fiona has. Like this album has been in my life for 10 plus years and I still listen to it like I don't know, at the very least once a month. I mean, it's a really powerful album, and I think like just so much fun to latch on to some of these unconventional rhythms and some of these odd vocal inflections that she has.
Yeah, totally. I'm going to say it. This is my favorite out of your picks for sure. I think it's my favorite Fiona Apple album in general. I've heard everything except Extraordinary Machine, and it's interesting that you do bring up that it's like a nice middle point to her career, because I never thought about it like that, but it definitely is. Like, I feel like it's simultaneously like her most catchy, but also her most like strange at the same time. Like, I feel like Fetch the Bolt Cutters kind of went a little bit too far into the jarring rhythms and the off kilter grooves and that kind of stuff. But this is like a good balance of like catchy Fiona with really good vocal melodies, really good vocal performances, and still having that like kind of off kilter feel at the same time. Her vocals on this album are so good. There's one, I think I wrote this down somewhere. There's one vocal inflection. It's in Left Alone where she says, "Tears calcify in my tummy." That vocal that she goes to there, that like flip into her head voice or whatever it's
Yeah.
called, that's like, dude, that's one of the best vocal performances I've heard ever. I feel like it's so good. Yeah, I love the writing on here. It's fantastic. It's very complex. It's very but also direct at points. I feel like Fetch the Bolt Cutters was very blunt and direct. I think this has a little bit more like imagery and symbolism, and it's a little bit more poetic, but it still goes into that direct style of writing that she does on Fetch the Bolt Cutters. So, yeah, this is, like I said, easily my favorite out of your picks. It's so good. I love it.
Yeah, I love this record, and it's like it's a record that's so relatable that I still like quote it to my friends sometimes. Like if your friends come to you
Yeah.
for like relationship advice and they're like, "Oh, this person's like all up on me and whatever," and I always quote them that thing from Left Alone where she says, "Oh, I need to remember it now."
Here, wait. Can I guess what you're gonna say? Because
Oh yeah, let's go.
I wrote this down too. How can I ask anyone to love me when all I do is beg to be left alone? Is that it?
Yeah, that's the line.
Yeah,
I quote that to my friends all the time. Yeah.
dude, so good.
And it's yeah, it's a really thoughtful like critique of yourself and like the boundaries that you want to keep for your personality versus giving yourself over to a relationship. So I love that.
Yeah, I think that's one of my favorite lyrics from the album for sure. It hits close to home for me, definitely. Largo too, the last track on this album, the
Oh
vocal
yeah.
performance on there and the piano on there, man, that's killer. Valentine is one of my favorites. I root for you,
Yeah.
you. So catchy. There's like a
I
kind of
know
like
there's like a fun vocal thing to sing along with every single song. Like Periphery has that thing where she does the periphery. I have a terrible
it's
singing
so
voice.
good.
But like yeah, there's like so many cool like it sounds cliche to say this, but like she truly uses her vocals as like their own instrument. Like they're a completely like part of the songwriting in ways
Yeah.
that I think people really like undermine when they're thinking about songwriting.
My second pick is an album from 2022 that was one of my favorites from that year. It actually is probably my favorite now. This is De Todas las Flores by Natalia
Quiero
Lafourcade.
quererte, yo solo quiero abrazarte.
It's kind of a Latin jazz, bossa nova. There's some folk elements in there as well. It's fully in Spanish, so obviously I can't understand anything that's being said. But honestly, that is what makes me love this album the most, is the fact that I just get to listen to the killer vocals, listen to the stellar instrumentation on this album without having to worry about dissecting every little lyric that hits me, you know? So I don't know, it's like easy listening in that way, but it's also like seriously just a good album as well. Like it's produced excellently. The musicality on here from all the performers here is top notch in my opinion. I wrote down here, it's like this album to me is like equivalent to a film that maybe I didn't like understand the plot or I didn't get everything, but it has like stunning cinematography. It's like the same thing to me. I have no clue what's going on, but it's beautiful. It's super singable. That's another thing I'll say. Like, I think it's something we don't appreciate often enough is how singable an album is, how easy it is to sing along with it. And this album, I just find myself singing in my head all the time. It's so fun to sing along to. And yeah, it's great. I know for you, this was a new album, so I'm curious to kind of hear what you thought about it a little bit.
Yeah, this is kind of like you said, it's a really interesting test of like trying to find meaning in music through a language barrier.
Yeah.
So I took a good amount of Spanish when I was in school, but like I understand, vague sentences here. I don't understand most of what's happening. But of all the picks you had, I think that this is the one that's the most just unfiltered with its beauty. Like it's just like really like very, it sounds stupid to say, but it sounds it's just very obviously beautiful. Like it's kind of
Yeah.
tricky because it has this aura that like it lulls you into being, this more calming, more kind of ephemeral listen, but it's easy to forget like how dense the production is, how dense the instrumentation is. Like as I was kind of analyzing it, all these little orchestral moments would like build and expand across these songs. Like the songs really breathe, like they're stretched out to like 5 or 6 minutes, and
Yeah.
it's interesting just to see the way that they like very subtly morph throughout the running time. But yeah, I thought that this was like a really intriguing listen.
Yeah, for sure. I That's one thing I do love about it as well, is just how like raw it is. Like it feels like you're in the room with these musicians. Like at points you can hear just like very subtle breaths in her voice, and it's very very intimate at points. Yeah, and it's just like the I guess like the finesse of a lot of the players here. Like they're so good at just like subtle little slowdowns, subtle like dynamic things that are just so beautiful.
Totally. All right. So next up for me is "In a Silent Way" by Miles Davis. I didn't think about this before the call, but I somehow ended up picking all of these mid-career albums where people are at like they're going from one point to another in terms of their experimentation. Like that's going to be true a little. It's going to be true a little bit with Bob Dylan. It's going to be true with Tom Waits too. But Miles Davis, like, I'm a giant jazz head, so I think actually one of the first messages I ever sent you was like a basics to loving jazz. Like here are
Yeah,
like 5 albums to start with,
yeah.
and I love jazz so much. And Miles, like, what's funny is if you asked any jazz musician like who their favorite musician is, they all may have different albums that are their favorite jazz album, but most jazz musicians will tell you that Miles Davis is their favorite jazz musician, and the reason for that, or favorite jazz composer, and the reason for that is because of like how much he was able to do in his career in terms of experimentation, in terms of like really taking that genre and just pushing it outward into, rewriting the language of what jazz could be. I mean, on
Mm-hmm.
top of that, it's just pure beauty. But like Davis started like in the bop period, like the hard bop and bebop period, as doing more of like live takes, quintets, trios, like usually a horn, a maybe sometimes a piano and a drummer, and they would just improv and cut these tracks live and then just put them on a record. Like that's how jazz was produced for the longest time. And in the late 60s, Miles was really the one that started pioneering in terms of production, in terms of like experimentation and studio trickery of like putting that into jazz work. So he's kind of at this precipice of his more conventional but like very virtuosic 60s work to a much more experimental period in the 70s that's known as his electric era. So
Yeah.
this is just like wildly innovative for its editing techniques, like the way that it layers different sounds on top of one another, different takes from like different times in the studio that they're piecing together. Like nobody had really. I mean, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong. I always hate saying anyone's the first to do anything, but it's widely accepted that widely accepted at that point that this is like one of the first jazz records to do that sort of thing. So you'll notice that like it will seem live for a while, but then like this little organ lick will come in out of nowhere, and that's
Yeah.
part of like the layering and the editing. But aside from that, I mean, like I was saying, it's just pure beauty to listen to. Like I don't know what to say aside from that. It's one of my most listened to albums of all time.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. The only other Miles Davis album I heard before this was Kind of Blue, which I think is his most popular, right?
Yep.
And I like that album's good, but from what I remember, that record more so just feels like traditional jazz, what you expect from a jazz record. I wrote down this is much more like jazz fusiony. I don't know if I'm correct in that assessment, but
Yep.
it's
That's true.
it's like you said, it's a lot more electronic. It's not my only other reference for jazz fusion is Mahavishnu Orchestra. It's not as busy as something that they would do. but it still offers a lot of like interesting melodies and grooves and just ideas. It feels kind of ambient in a way as well. You still do get some like traditional horns and trumpet and whatnot, but for the most part, it's very electronic, very subtle and gentle. The section at the beginning of In a Silent Way, the track, dude, that section is so good, and the end of that track too, it's so like calming and meditative. You got this like droning bass underneath the entire thing, some electric piano that comes in, the guitar is so good. It floats along in this way that's like so easy to get lost in, and I don't know, it feels very mysterious in a way. So
It only gets, if you want to continue learning about Miles Davis, it only gets more wild from here. His electric
okay.
period has some of like the craziest stuff I've ever heard. This is like definitely the most gentle of them because they get pretty free jazzy and pretty insane. But definitely worth a look at some point. But it's like Miles Davis is one of those discographies that is so much fun to dive into, and almost like whether the album is a masterpiece or not, there's always something interesting going on. So
Yeah. Third pick here is an album from 2020, another newer album, I know. This is Songs by Adrian Lenker.
Through your eyes I see the smile you bring to me.
Kind of a singer-songwriter folk record. This record's vulnerable, it's raw, it's human, it's calm, it's gentle, it's warm. I feel like it has Adrian's most memorable solo songs. Obviously, she has some really great and memorable work with Big Thief, but I feel like this is her best album in terms of a solo effort. I think this album's perfectly paced. Like, I was listening to it earlier today, and I just found that like each track ends exactly when it needs to. There's no songs that really go on for too long, but it also does take its time, and it's also patient when it does need to be, like the track Come, for example. Lyrically, a lot of this project is Adrian, at least what I think, attempting to put into words kind of these indescribable feelings. And I think it's her kind of inability to fully convey the power of these emotions that makes this record so heartbreaking and human. I think it's extremely relatable in that way, because we want to make sense of things that we never really will make sense of. So yeah, I think this record's fantastic. It's mostly just acoustic guitar and vocals. It's very stripped back, but Adrian's such a talented singer and just a talented writer as well. Had you heard this before we did this video, or was this your first listen?
this was my first listen to this record. I'm familiar with Big Thief and Adrian Lenker's album from this year. Is it Bright Future?
Yep, Bright Future.
Yeah. That's a great record. It will probably be on my top 10 of the year. And I thought this was great too. It's a bit more like dialed back, which I don't mind. But I thought like the lyricism was just like really, really good. Like she lets things stand on their own in a way that's open to interpretation, but at the same time, like you know exactly what she means. Kind of like the Microphones album, actually. Like the second track has this amazing line: "Everything eats and is eaten, time is fed." And I was like,
I wrote that down too.
Yeah, I was
That lyric
pondering
is
that
so
for a
good.
while. Yeah, I was
good.
pondering that for a while and how true that is. Just like from a consumptive point of view, but also just like a aging point of view and
Like
everything. I just thought it was really astute.
like a cycle of life type point of view, you know?
Yeah, I was just gonna talk about how like these themes of like grief and solitude. Like we were talking about solitude before with Fiona Apple, and you can definitely like feel her like reckoning somehow with how much she wants to be alone and what that loneliness kind of means to her.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think Half Return is a standout for me. That one's so beautiful, just kind of talking about childhood memories. Come is probably one of the saddest songs I've heard ever. Just the writing on that is so earnest and raw. And one thing I found doing research about this is it's actually what she deems to be her most personal album, which I thought was interesting because I feel like everything she does is personal. But the more I think about it, in her other work, she does tend to write a little bit more just like, say, like a story or in a third person kind of point of view. So yeah, I thought that was interesting for sure. I think this is going to be a hot take, maybe. I think this is going to be a classic. This is going to be considered a classic for years to come, okay?
It could be.
10 years down the line, 10 years down the line, I think we're still going to be talking about this record. So there you go.
Yeah,
Adrian
there's
Lenker's songs. It's
There's
great.
like a timelessness to the way that like she talks about a lot of these universal truths. I mean, the things that she talks about aren't going anywhere. You know,
Yeah,
these are
no.
things we're gonna
Yeah.
be pondering these things and for our entire lives. So I totally understand that. So I'm gonna talk about "Blood on the Tracks" by Bob Dylan.
Buckets of rain, buckets of tears. Got all them buckets coming out of my ears.
Another mid-career album, but like this is coming after his like wildly popular and very well-known 60s period, and then he kind of has this renaissance in 1997, and since then like he's been putting out killer records, but Dylan never got to the level of experimentation of some of the other people on this list. I mean, some people might like take issue with me for saying that, but I don't think so. But anyway, this is a cool thing in talking about the person and how personal the lyrics are versus the stories they're telling, because I think that we have this idea that whenever somebody's writing a song, it must be how they're feeling personally, where sometimes they're just trying to tell you a story about something that they concocted. So Blood on the Tracks has like long been debated. Is this a breakup album? You know, is this an album about Bob Dylan's like most recent marriage? Like one of his children, Jacob Dylan, who's also a musician, actually said that this album feels like his parents talking, and I always thought that was really interesting. But Bob himself, in like the rare times that he actually gives interviews, has said that he was more interested in telling like universal short stories with this record.
Mm.
So anyway, this is actually getting into the record. Is it's just it's an amazing breakup album. It's really really like astute about the way that we love people and our inability to love people at certain times. And one of the things that's really interesting about the history of this album is this album was recorded twice. So it was recorded with full instrumentation and a full backing band, and then another recording that was much more stripped back. And he decided to split it evenly between more stripped back versions of the songs and then more like heavily instrumental versions of the songs. And you can actually listen to the outtakes that didn't make the cut on his outtakes record, More Blood, More Tracks. So it's really interesting. Like
Mm-hmm.
I love the version of Tangled Up in Blue that's here, but like the stripped back one is really beautiful too. So I kind of like the idea of like having these lost masterpieces as outtakes too with this record. It kind of adds to the mystique, but just
Yeah.
terrific lyricism. And I think just really, really beautiful harmonies. I'm not sure how familiar you are with Bob Dylan, but I feel like this is his record that has the least fluff and is to the most to the point and like the most astute in his observations.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, this is the only Bob Dylan album I've heard. So going into this, I was like, I kind of had an expectation of what I expected Bob Dylan to sound like, you know? And this
Yeah.
kind of, honestly, it met it, but it also feels a little bit more like dirty than I expected, if that makes sense. Like it's not as touched up or polished as I expected someone as popular as Bob Dylan to be. So yeah, this one took a little bit to grow on me, but it after a couple listens, I've really started to love it. The harmonica on here is sick a lot of the time. I expected the vocals to be a little bit more like kind of understated, but he does kind of get wild sometimes on this album, which is pretty fun. There's something about the chord progressions themselves, and I'm not like I don't know everything about music theory, but the chord progressions are so like powerful in a way. It feels very classic. It feels very, I don't know, just powerful, I guess is the best way to put it. So you get some of those tracks where they feel very serious and powerful and kind of like maybe like a ballad. But then there's also some tracks that are a little bit more fun and they have kind of some swagger to them. Meet Me in the
Mm-hmm.
Morning, I think, is one of those. Yeah, like again, I'm not familiar with Bob Dylan that much, but after this first listen, I like what I'm hearing, and I think I'm probably gonna react to some more of his records. So yeah, I think
Yeah,
it's
he has
great.
an amazing discography. I would
Yeah.
skip everything in the 80s just to save you some time, but virtually everything else is just terrific. Like
Yeah.
he like bar none with Tom Waits, who we'll talk about in a little bit, has like one of the best discographies out there. Yeah, I love this record. Actually, just on a personal note, this record played from beginning to end during dinner at my wedding. That's how much it means
Oh.
to both. Yeah, to both of us. So I love this record.
My next pick here is an album from, I believe, the early 2000s. This is a kind of ambient record from Tim Hecker. This is Haunt Me. For those of you that don't know, Tim Hecker is a Canadian producer, composer, and sound artist. I believe he's done some film soundtracks as well. Admittedly, my knowledge of ambient music is pretty limited, but I would say that this is probably my favorite ambient album ever. And the reason is pretty personal, I feel like. There's something really frigid and cold about this album, and I think it resonates with me because of where I'm from. It feels like a direct sonic representation of where I live. I live in northern Canada, for those of you that don't know. As you'd expect, it gets extremely cold in the winters. The winters are long. There's stretches where it'll be just consistently -30 to -40 for weeks straight. And this, like I said, this album is cold. It's frigid. It feels like a representation of that. I feel like the structure of the album as well also kind of helps in portraying this feeling to me. The tracks flow together in a really seamless way to the point where they make the entire album just feel like a song itself. And this kind of like never-ending quality of the album is very reminiscent of the never-ending quality of the winter here. So it just that might
That's awesome.
That might be a weird combination or a weird comparison to make, but it just feels so representative of that, and it hits close to home in that way. So yeah, I love it. I'm curious what you thought of this.
So I have heard one Tim Hecker album before, and it was Rave Death 1972, which
haven't
I
heard that.
really liked. And the only reason I heard that record was because it came out at a time that I was really getting into like indie music, and I think Pitchfork gave it like a really good review, and I checked it out. At that age, I was like everything that anyone says bad about Pitchfork readers, I was exactly that person. But I did find a lot of good music from that time. So I don't have a ton of experience with ambient music either, but like I do find that I tend to put it on when I'm reading, like, and usually when I do, it's more like Brian Eno. I don't know if you ever heard of Brian Eno record,
Yep.
but like Music for
Yep.
Airports is a pretty famous ambient record. But I thought this was really good. Like I'm ignorant of how to make ambient music, but like there's such an originality of sound palette here. You know, there's
Yeah.
like with my ignorance of production, I don't even know where you start to make albums that sound like this.
Yeah.
So I found that really, really intriguing. But another cool thing is when I was listening to it is it was really easy to transition in and out of like active listening. So you could kind of put it on while you're studying or while you're doing work or something, and then you'll hear like this cool like music cue, and you'll be like, oh, that's interesting, and then you'll
Yeah.
pay more attention to the music for a while. But its textures are also easy enough to like lull you into something that makes you more productive too.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I feel like this album I fell asleep to for like a month straight back in January earlier this year because it's just so, I don't know, it's so calming, but it also gets a little bit eerie at times. It gets a little bit haunting at times, as that title would suggest, obviously.
Yep.
I think that's another thought I had too listening to it earlier today was like, how does someone even begin to think of making something like this? Like, I don't even know where you start. You know, it's just so alien to me that it just there's something magical about it, you know? I will say that one thing I found when researching this a little bit is that a lot of these sounds are actually like piano or guitar that he's just like warping, distorting, and muddying up to make feel like a synth or make it feel kind of alien in a way. So I think that's also like a kind of a subconscious reason why I connect to this album so much is because it has that like natural kind of real foundation, even if you don't necessarily pick up that it's those instruments. Like I don't know, maybe that seeps into my subconscious in a way that makes me connect to it a little bit more. It's also noteworthy to mention that he has a background in post-rock, making post-rock as well, which I feel like you can kind of hear in this album in terms
Totally,
of
yeah.
some of the progressions and just how it sounds. So I thought that was interesting as well.
Off topic, but on topic, like, do you just not go outside for like 6 months? Like,
Yeah.
that's very cold.
Yeah, pretty much. Maybe not 6 months. We'd get like, I guess like a month of what I was saying, -30 to -40.
Yeah. All right, I think this is my last pick actually, which
I
is
think so.
Rain Dogs by Tom Waits. I should have said this at the top, but like if we did this record a year, or if we did this video a year ago or a year from now, my picks could be different. Like it's always the same. like 20 albums, but if you ask me for the top 5, it would be different slots depending on just how I'm feeling. But
Yeah.
Rain Dogs would always be in the top 5. Like Rain Dogs is from the first time I heard it, I just didn't know that music could sound like this. It almost sounds like like a distorted experimental Bob Dylan. Like if you take
Yeah.
all of the tenets of folk music and of like kind of jazzy cabaret New Orleans style music and just like run it through this like ugly distortion filter. This is another mid-career album where Tom Waits had his earlier albums in the 60s and 70s were much more like pretty witty, like swaggery guy who plays a piano. They're great records. They're really great records. But as he oddly, as he sobered up and he stopped drinking alcohol and he met his wife and started writing with his wife, he got way more experimental and way more weird with his music. So this starts with Swordfish Trombones, which precedes this album, and then goes into Rain Dogs and then goes through the rest of his career. Like he gets even wild in the 2000s and in the 90s. So Rain Dogs is like, I think the real like perfection of his experimental structure. Like Swordfish Trombones is a little too experimental. Like it doesn't have as much form. It doesn't have as much like focus. But Rain Dogs, like just top to bottom, is just a great record. Like the songs, they all focus on the downtrodden. Like they tell stories of these bartenders and prostitutes and like heavy drinkers, like all of the forgotten people of society. They have these unconventional song structures, like almost like dirty blues that have this like snazzy drawn out accordions and like this drunk sounding piano. Like all the percussion on this record and any of his records is crazy. Like he tries to find the most uncommon methods of percussion. So I forget what song it is on this album, but they couldn't get a percussion sound that they liked, so they started taking like dresser drawers out of their dresser and started like banging on them to try to find a cool percussion sound. So like that's just like the way that he approaches his production and his songwriting that I think is really cool. Like I think this is the album that taught me the most that beauty can lie in like ugliness and grit. And I've never heard anyone or anything like this, you know, from when I first heard it all the way up until now.
I agree. Yeah, this was my first listen to Tom Waits in general, and like my first thought was get this guy a glass of water. Okay, his voice is insane. It's so husky. Yeah. It's so raspy. It's like, how does this guy make these sounds with his voice? It's crazy. Yeah, it feels just kind of like a drunk guy in the corner of a bar, just telling you his life stories in a way. There's some tracks here that are very jagged and sharp, kind of off kilter. But then there's also some more like kind of ballad, sweet, smooth, and tender tracks, which I thought was really surprising. I thought it was just going to be kind of this unhinged sound throughout the entire thing, but it does get a little bit sweet at times. Specifically, the vocals on Big Black Mariah. I don't know if you remember what that track sounds like, but his vocals on that.
That's my favorite track on the record, actually. It's wild. Yeah.
His vocals are insane on that. Like, actually crazy. Dude, the fact that this came out in the 80s, too, I feel like people must have been, like, so surprised when this came out. Like, nothing in the 80s, at least that I know, sounds like this, so it's crazy.
Yeah, you could definitely find some pretty wild, like, underground music, but as far as, like, I mean, Tom Waits isn't exactly mainstream either, but as far as, like, mainstream adjacent, I don't know that there's anything that sounds like this, and nobody sounds like, even to this day, like Tom Waits. I mean, you could see his experimentation and like the way that he approaches percussion. Like, it definitely anticipates a variety of people. Even like Fiona Apple, it wouldn't shock me if she was thinking about Tom Waits with some of the percussion on like Fetch the Bolt Cutters. But yeah, just like what a great record. And I love the idea that he takes his time in his songs to write about like the forgotten in society, but not in like a sentimental way, just in a way that's like almost like a mythology. Like there's this mythos around this whole like underground part of society that we don't think about. And he just like, he has such a cool like mystique as an artist. He's one of those that like, he doesn't do interviews. He doesn't really like go out in public a lot. He just has this like really strange aura. Like he was on David Letterman once, and he just said a bunch of wild stuff about how he shot his TV with a shotgun and like weird shit like that. Yeah, he's just a wild dude.
That was one thing I was actually going to ask you, was like what his relevance was in popular music in the 80s, but it sounds like he was more kind of an underground artist. Because I feel like if you look strictly at the numbers, like on Spotify, like he has pretty high streaming numbers, but I don't know if that's necessarily reflective of his impact back then.
I would say that, yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Obviously I am old. I wasn't around in the 80s, but I think that this record definitely made a splash probably in the underground and like people that really loved music in the 80s, but it's
Yeah.
become more appreciative. Like most of, and this is maybe just because the people I hang out with are like really into art and music and stuff. They all know who Tom Waits is, but if I like went on the street and started asking people if they know who Tom Waits is, I'm not totally sure they do. Or maybe they know
Yeah.
of Tom Waits, but they don't like they've never listened to him.
Yeah. That's fair. Yeah.
Yes.
That's fair.
So yeah, I'm not totally sure, but I feel like most people who are really obsessed with music probably have some kind of respect for Tom Waits.
All right, let's move into my last pick of the video. This is kind of a neo soul R&B album from the 90s. This is Love Deluxe by Sade.
There must have been an angel by my side.
Now, I initially thought, before I ever heard this record, I initially thought of Sade just as like music that your friend's like cool mom would listen to or something. But this album's a lot more atmospheric, a lot more sensual, hypnotic, and ethereal than I thought it would be. There's some trip hop that is kind of integrated here as well that I think creates some really hypnotic rhythms. It's kind of just, this album to me is like just taking a nice long warm shower. You just close your eyes, you float along to the smooth production, the smooth vocals. I think one thing that actually made me want to check out this album is that MF Doom samples Kiss of Life in his track Doomsday. So I heard that track.
That's where I recognized it from.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yes. So I heard that track and I was like, this beat is beautiful. I got to check out what this sample is, and that led me to Sade. Yeah, vocally, I think she's just stunning. Like, the vocals here they bring kind of an elegance to this and class to this. I feel like it's easy to write this off as just kind of like romantic background music, like whatever, it's boring. But if you really listen to it, the production is super lush. The songwriting, I think, is beautiful. The atmosphere is so dreamy, and I feel like it's kind of a step above the often cheesy kind of music that I think this is pulling from. So yeah, I wouldn't say I have the strongest like emotional connection to this album when compared to the other albums that I've brought up here. But it's a gorgeous listen, and it's kind of shifted my perspective of this era and kind of style of R&B. So yeah, I'm curious what your thoughts were on this.
Dude, it's so funny what you said about a friend's cool mom listening to this, because the reason that I wanted to talk about this record was because it reminds me so much of the music that was played in my house when I was growing up.
Okay.
So my mom was like a big fan of Motown, like 90s R&B and 90s hip hop. So like the music that I listened to growing up was like Run DMC and like the first two D'Angelo records.
Yeah.
Like that was on constantly in my house, and that reminded me so much of like, this is, I don't know if my mom knows about this record, but this is totally something that she would have played at the time. And I always like to think about, and I don't know if you're interested in chiming in on us too, but like where like the music that I listened to growing up, or like music that was my parents played in the house, like how that factored into where I am now with music, and if it has any bearing. Because like I feel like sometimes you're reacting against what your parents liked, and other times it like weirdly finds its way into your music taste without you thinking about it. But
Yeah.
I thought this album was really cool. Just like trip hop, relaxing production, like easy to get lost in. Again, it reminded me a lot of like earlier D'Angelo records, just like a little less swagger and a little more like Massive Attack style.
Yeah.
And I just love that like icy percussion and how they use piano as like a little flourish throughout it, like against the booming bass. Like it's beautiful.
Dude, yeah. It's funny you bring up your parents, because it's one thing that like I think about a lot with my channel is that like people always comment like, how have you never heard the Beatles before? Have you never heard this classic album? And what I always say is my parents didn't like listen to anything when I was growing up. I don't remember any kind of music in the house growing up. So that's why a lot of my first reactions are like people are surprised that I've never heard it. But I will say also that it's like a super singable record. Again, I'm gonna bring that up, but like it's just so fun to sing along to. Sade's voice on here is just it's stellar, dude. It's so good. So yeah, that's my last pick. There you
This
go.
is a really cool midpoint between like I know Massive Attack and like Portishead can kind of be hard for some people to get into, but if you're like somewhere between like a 90s R&B lover or like a Massive Attack lover, this is a great midpoint for those two types of styles. It's kind of cool to see them overlap in this way, actually.
There you go. Those are our 5 albums. Thank you for coming on. Of course, I think this was a great video, great discussion, and honestly, I'm gonna say like you gave me a lot of suggestions that I loved, and a lot of stuff that's gonna kind of spark what I listen to next. So, yeah,
Cool, man. Yeah, that's awesome. Same here. I mean, I think it's really like I always say, like, read the books that your friends recommend you. Like, listen to the albums that your friends recommend you. Like,
yeah,
9 times out of 10, they're interesting and they're gonna like expand your mind. And like your pick certainly did that for me. So I'm really interested to dig into like some of these discographies and see like what else I've been missing. So
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's really really cool. And look forward to having you on our channel with movies. That should be a lot of fun.
Dude, I'm excited. Thank you again for coming on. Hopefully, you guys enjoyed. As I said in the beginning, make sure to go follow Movie Husbands. I will link it down below. Thank you guys for watching. Leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace out.